it brings us to a point of realizing that we need to be truthful about ourselves before God. No skeletons. You see, the more we try to hide things about ourselves, the more God arranges for us to be exposed. I want you to hear that. I want you to hear that. See, we were doing a fantastic job of covering up the sex scandals in the church until God made it public. That's why I'm not too kosher with what the late John Paul did vis-a-vis canon law. He's the man who was really responsible for all of this. If he had done what he was supposed to do, we would not have been in this mess. Take him out and give him a nice fancy job in Rome. And the priest catching the royal behind. You know, we are always made the scapegoats of everything, the pastors. So it demands facing the truth about ourselves. It brings us to be honest before God. But this thing about denying self is very important. There's a prayer by St. Francis, which is preserved in the Basilica of Francis in Assisi. It's called the Praises of God. And St. Francis sings the Song of the Poor in praise of God. And he says, you are love, you are wisdom, you are humility. God is humility. You are endurance, you are rest, you are peace, you are joy and gladness, you are justice and moderation. When I first read this prayer some time ago, I said to myself, St. Francis, I don't understand what you're saying here. Because how could Francis call God humility? You know, when you read Francis, you know he was kind of cuckoo. So I thought this was one of the cuckoo prayers he wrote, you know. If he was making a list of virtues found in God, how could you say God is humility? Because humility cannot be found in the Trinity. Because the Trinity is glorious and holy and all-powerful and full of light. But in one careful reflection, it is I who was cuckoo, not St. Francis. He was right. He gave us these words to give us one of the most powerful definitions of God. That God is absolutely humble. He humbled himself to become a slave. Absolutely humble. If humility means denying oneself of everything, then God is totally humble. Because it is God who can do nothing but lower himself beneath God. Isn't that what Jesus did? He, though in the form of God, emptied himself to become less than God. That is what humility is all about. You see, there is nothing above God, so God can't go higher. But humanity is beneath God, so he could come lower. And all that you and I are is because of God. So don't think that in striving to become more, you have to become more than your brother and sister. No. You have to lift your brother and sister with you. That is what humility is all about. That as you empty yourself, you will be raised up with your brother and sister as you serve out of love. As you serve out of love. When God does something outside of himself, God could only lower himself, humble himself. That is what he has done since he created the world. The story of salvation is none other than the story of successive moves of God humbling himself. Francis sees it this way. He says, every day God humbles himself just as he did when he came from his heavenly throne. And you see that quotation taken from Wisdom 18 verse 15. He came from his heavenly throne into the virgin's womb. Every day he descends from the bosom of the Father, hear this, into the hands of the priest at the altar. How more humble could God come? He becomes food and drink. How much more humble? Francis tells us about the Eucharist. He says, look at God's total humility when you look at Eucharist. Look at God's total humility. And this was a very familiar idea among the early fathers of the church. They spoke of God's condescension, God's coming down. God made himself small so that humanity could approach him. If he had come big, we would have been afraid. He made himself small. He took upon himself the language of humanity. He who is the creator of all languages. This is very true of the incarnation. The Word became flesh. The Word which is eternal became limited. Because flesh is limited. We only here for a time.